Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to beautiful Boston Common, America's first park. My name is Chris Cook and I have the great honor to be the Commissioner of Boston Parks and Recreation. We're here today to celebrate our friendship with Halifax, Nova Scotia. First and foremost, though, I'd like to thank the men and women of the Boston Parks and Recreation Department who do such a terrific job taking care of this park and all our parks in the city. So if you could give them a round of applause, I'd appreciate that. And secondly, I'd like to introduce a great friend to Boston Parks and someone who's really supported this relationship with our friends up in Nova Scotia. Ladies and gentlemen, nice warm welcome for the Mayor of Boston, Martin J. Walsh.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I want to thank Chris and the Parks Department as well. I want to thank Premier Steve McNeil from Nova Scotia is with us today. Thank you, Premier, for being with us today. And thank you for the beautiful scarf that I have on today. I'll wear it with pride tonight. I also want to thank Mayor Savage from Halifax has joined us today. The men and women that's behind me, men and women of the Boston Fire Department, all of our public safety officials that are here, all of our guests from Halifax, thank you for being here with us today. This is obviously a significant year in this relationship. We're celebrating 100 years of our friendship with the people of Halifax. I want to thank Commissioner Cook for representing the city of Boston, the tree send-off a few weeks ago. It was a beautiful ceremony, and he was excited to go and represent the city of Boston. And we are grateful for Nova Scotia's continued generosity. I also want to thank Boston Fire Commissioner Joe Finn, who couldn't be with us today, but he and his team are going to Halifax next week to commemorate the 100th anniversary. While we are celebrating 100 years of friendship, we're also remembering a very terrible tragedy. The Halifax Explosion remains one of the worst man-made disasters of all time. I want to recognize the people who lost their lives and the families and descendants today. It was a devastating event that we will never and should never forget. But it also sparked a special bond between our cities. In 1917, the mayor of Boston was James Michael Curley. He immediately reached out to the Consul General and said Boston was ready to help in any way that we could. We sent food and water, medical supplies, along with hundreds of doctors, nurses, and volunteers. I am proud for our city stepping up in such a big way. And I admire the people of Halifax for their resilience. The people of Boston know about resilience as well. We don't let tragedies define us. We rebuild, we move forward, and we are stronger for that. And we know that we are stronger together when we work together. The friendship we share means a lot to us here in the city of Boston. It means a lot to the people of Nova Scotia as well. It's a time when we see hostility and tension across the world. We are especially thankful for our friendships. We set an example for the rest of the world on how we can take care of each other, especially in the time of need. In a few moments, we'll be dedicating a monument here on Boston Common to commemorate our friendship. Visitors who come here will learn about the special bond our cities share and about the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us here today, and I hope to see you all at the tree lighting tonight. It'll be a beautiful night in the city of Boston. I know it's a little cold, and the people from Halifax have no reason to be shivering because I think it's colder there. So I want to thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mayor Walsh. As the mayor said, this is a wonderful relationship, and it's fueled by the beautiful people of Nova Scotia. And when you go there, you're just wrapped in a warmth whenever you tell somebody that you're from Boston. It's an extraordinary relationship, and it's something that we continue to build on. And it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful province. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the Premier of Nova Scotia, the Honorable Stephen McNeil.
Thank you very much, Chris. Let me just say on behalf of Nova Scotians, our great thanks to you. In the last 4 years since I've had the privilege to be the Premier, you've been a great conduit coming into our city to ensure we have a great send-off for our tree to come down and recognize the great people of Boston. Your Worship, it's great to be with you as always. Minister Miller, Your Worship, and Beth, I look forward to hearing from you. You were a star last night, let me say, with your description. And if I can say, you put a human face. You put a human face, and you actually shared your parents' story through your words, and it was a real honor for all of us who were there last night to listen to you as you described that terrible day through the eyes of your parents. December 6th, 1917, obviously, as all of you know, was a horrific day in our province and in our city. 2,000 people lost their lives, 9,000 people were injured, 25,000 people lost their homes, and our first responders standing behind us, Halifax Regional Police, Halifax Fire, headed towards that. And I want you to think about that for a moment. Imagine the devastation that was taking place in the north end of our city, and our first responders behind us were heading in to see what they could do for their fellow citizens. I know in our audience today there are a number of nurses who are representing their profession. Your sisters in 1917 did the same thing, left their families and headed in to ensure that the people of the north end of Halifax had the support they needed to try to deal with what was and continues to be one of the largest disasters, not only in the history of our country, but globally. Think about that. And when we called out, it was the people of Boston who responded to our needs. There were many people globally who did, but the people of Boston responded in spades, and the next morning they arrived. And as has been said many times, the day after that disaster was one of the worst snowstorms that we had had in that period of time. And if they hadn't come, as I said last night, just imagine what would have happened or could have happened in the ensuing days. But it was their friendship, and they were responding to the human need of us in Nova Scotia, and in particularly in Halifax. And there's never enough that we can do to say thank you. And this tree behind us is a symbol of that great relationship and friendship. I've said this, Mayor, I've said this many times. I get a chance to represent our province in lots of places, but when I come here, I feel like, quite frankly, I am visiting cousins. There is a bond from this explosion, but since then, whether it was through the Depression when some of our families came here to look for work to support our families at home, or the relationship that continues to build. You're a working community. You're a working city, and we're very proud of the men and women and the working class province that we have, and I believe that's part of the enduring connection that we have as communities. And we need to continue to build on it to make sure that we not only recognize the great generosity of the people of Boston in 1917 when they came to our aid, but we also need to continue to celebrate our enduring friendship. The friendship that builds and continue to build, whether it's an economic tie or a social tie, continue to come and celebrate with each other. And yes, when there are challenges in our communities, whether it be the explosion at home, whether it be the terrible bombing at the Boston Marathon, we respond to each other to make sure that we know, with all of the things that are going on in the world, we have friends that we can turn to and count on in our darkest days. And that's what I believe this whole celebration symbolizes. It's the beginning of our Christmas season. In my mind, this is when Christmas starts for me and for my family, and I believe it's when it starts for all of us. The spirit of giving, and the spirit of supporting, the spirit of loving one another and appreciating each other for all the good that is happening. This year, we've dedicated this tree to first responders. Standing behind me, you see ours. I know there are a number of first responders who would be here in the audience, but one of the things that's been lost and not remembered in this whole process, Halifax Fire, during the Halifax Explosion, lost 9 firefighters during the explosion. That's the largest loss of life for firefighters in Canadian history. Largest loss of life in firefighters in Canadian history in 1917. We are indebted every day to our first responders in our province, but think about that day in 1917 when our first responders came to our aid and then were supported by the great people of Boston. To those of us from here from Nova Scotia, let me say thank you for traveling here to help us celebrate this friendship. While we are talking about the explosion, I think tonight will be a celebration of our friendship and the possibilities of us continuing to work together to ensure that both of our communities celebrate all we have to celebrate. Merry Christmas to all of you.
Thank you, Premier, for those kind words and for your friendship. And when you think about Halifax, you hear words like colleges and arts and the warmth of the people and innovation and technology. And those are all words that could be used to describe Boston. It's even more remarkable, though, when you think about the scope of this tragedy and the fact that it's only been 100 years and the accomplishments of Halifax, that when you go there, it's such a vibrant and such an alive city. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the Mayor of Halifax, Michael Savage.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Mayor Walsh, Premier McNeil, Premier McNeil's family, former Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, Myra Freeman, people who keep us safe, fire and police. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. I just want to give some of you a little sense of the impact of this explosion 100 years ago. On December the 6th, 1917, Mary Jane Hinch woke up to get her 10 children off to school and her husband off to work. When she settled down, eventually, the next day, she had no children, no husband. She lost 6 siblings. She lost 6 siblings, her mother, her 10 children, and her husband in the Halifax explosion. 24 hours later, they found her under the rubble and under the snow, and she was saved. And a few months later, she gave birth to Hubert. She was pregnant. That is the scope of the Halifax explosion, the impact on one person and one family. In 1958, she died, and her body was interred beside the rest of her family at Mount Herman Cemetery in Halifax, the largest man-made explosion in the world prior to Hiroshima. But the story of Mary Jean is the story of the explosion. Unthinkable tragedy and horror, but a resilience to go on, to have that child, and to continue life. And with friends like Boston coming to our aid, Halifax has endured, and 100 years later, I think Halifax is stronger than ever. Proud of our friendship with this great city of Boston. We're so pleased and so honored to be here on the Boston Comming, to celebrate this, and to really thank you for the support that you've given us over the years, and to let you know that anybody who lives in Halifax and the Halifax region has a very special place in their heart for the people of Boston. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mayor. As both mayors and the Premier mentioned, this year is being dedicated to first responders, and when we think about the heroic actions of so many people involved, here representing just one of those many stories is the registered nurse. Please give her a warm welcome, Beth Thompson.
Good morning, and welcome to all our first responders, our dignitaries. Very good to see you all again. I don't think I can compete with Mayor Savage's story.
I apologize. I'm just going to...
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't think I can compete with Mayor Savage's story about the personal impact of this man-made explosion. But I do want to share my family's story, just a few of them, because I heard them all the time when I was growing up. I'm Beth Thompson, Beth Hubley Thompson, or Hubley, as you say down east. Beth Hubley Thompson, RN. I'm a Mass General Hospital School of Nursing graduate from the class of 1953, and I'm still a practicing nurse. Not a first responder. I come in after them. My pathway to nursing, though, can be traced back to the events in Halifax on December 6, 1917. At that time, my mother, Hazel Mosier, was 12 years old, and my father, Bert Hubley, was 11 years old. Both were growing up in Halifax, but each told 2 very different stories about what happened that day. At precisely 9:07 a.m., my mother was just putting her hand on the doorknob of the Shabukto Elementary School when her world burst open with a big cloud of smoke and debris flying through the air, glass, if you can imagine this, a huge noise. And she thought God was punishing her for being late for school. She turned to rush home, but she was caught up in the frantic crowds pouring out into the streets. Some were cut and bleeding and crying for help. When she finally reached her street, Cork Street, the police had cordoned it off for crowd control. Only the pleas of a bystander alerted the police to the fact that my grandmother was standing down the street waving for her to come home, and they let my mother pass. My father had been sitting in his classroom, 5th grade, and he was waiting for the morning lesson to begin, when suddenly the glass window shattered beside him and spread glass across the room. He thought the Germans had attacked. He brushed the glass shards from his clothes and started to run home. His house was right on Chebucto Road. But the crowds and the debris-filled streets slowed him down, and there were men and boys already on the street, picking up the debris, trying to clear a path for the emergency vehicles to get through and for people to pass down into their homes. Bert joined this crowd of men and boys and worked for the next 3 days, putting up tents out in the arm for people who had lost their houses. You heard how many were completely destroyed. Cooking food for people who didn't have access to their own food supplies, and all the other important things that needed to be done to support this community that was devastated. These experiences and the days following in many ways shaped the rest of my parents' lives. Hazel had seen first aid stations on the crosswalks, and they were staffed by nurses and doctors. She watched them cleaning and dressing wounds. Many, including her own sister, had had eye injuries or lost their eyes. She was so impressed by these caregivers that in 1925, Hazel left Nova Scotia and enrolled in the Birmingham Union Hospital Training School for Nurses. In 1920, my father, with his family, moved to Massachusetts, where he met my mother and married her in 1930. He built a successful plastering business that enabled him, as he liked to say, to build homes for families. From so much destruction on that terrible day in Halifax came so many stories of humanity, large and small, including those of my parents, who taught us through their example and their lives to be concerned for the well-being of others, neighbor helping neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth, for sharing that story with us. At this time, I'd like to ask the Premier and Mayor Walsh and Mayor Savage, as well as Minister Miller, as well as the first responders, to join us over by the monument for the unveiling.